The sleek black Mercedes glides through Riverside Falls like liquid shadow against autumn light. Behind tinted windows, billionaire Catherine Sterling watches her experiment unfold. 4 men stand before the community bank, each gripping an unlimited black credit card that could change everything. The first 3 move like predators sensing prey. Lawyer Mitchell Hayes vanishes into Whitmore Jewelers, emerging with a $15,000 Rolex wrapped around his wrist. Dr. Preston Clark roars away from the BMW dealership, leather seats still warm from the showroom. Businessman Vincent Torres cradles a diamond engagement ring, its facets catching the dying sun. But Owen Crawford remains statue still on the sidewalk, his carpenter's hands treating the black plastic like fragile glass. His weathered face tracks not wealth, but his 8-year-old son Caleb racing toward him, school backpack bouncing with innocent joy. 2 hours dissolve into evening shadows. 3 fortunes spent. 1 card untouched. Catherine's breath fogs the window as she leans closer. What this single father chose instead would shatter every assumption she'd ever held. Owen's calloused fingers traced the edges of the black card as Caleb crashed into his legs with the force of pure happiness. The boy's sneakers squeaked against wet pavement, his cheeks flushed from running 3 blocks from Riverside Elementary. Catherine watched through her telephoto lens as Owen knelt to his son's eye level, the credit card disappearing into his back pocket like a forgotten afterthought. His voice carried across the street, warm honey over gravel, asking about spelling tests and playground adventures. Caleb's animated gestures painted stories in the air, while his father listened with the intensity of a man who understood that childhood was both precious and fleeting. The Mercedes engine purred softly as Catherine's driver shifted into gear, following the pair at a respectful distance. Owen Crawford lived in a world measured by sawdust and honest sweat, where every dollar earned meant food on the table and a roof that didn't leak. His Ford pickup truck coughed to life outside their rental house on Maple Street, paint peeling from the shutters like old skin. Catherine parked across the street, watching through binoculars as father and son disappeared inside. Through illuminated windows, she glimpsed fragments of their evening routine. Caleb spreading homework across a kitchen table, scarred by years of use. Owen stirring something simple on the stove, his movements economical and practiced. The television flickered in the corner, its screen cracked but still functional. This was poverty with dignity, struggle without surrender. 3 years ago, Owen had been an engineer at Portland Dynamics, designing bridge supports that would stand for generations. Sarah had been alive then, her laughter filling rooms with warmth that central heating could never match. Caleb had been 5, sticky fingers and boundless energy, convinced his parents were superheroes who could fix anything. The accident changed everything in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Black ice on Interstate 84. A semi-truck driver who fell asleep at the wheel. Sarah's hand torn from Owen's as paramedics worked frantically in the ambulance. The funeral had been a blur of casseroles and condolences, but the silence afterward stretched like an ocean. Owen couldn't design bridges anymore when his own foundation had crumbled. The move to Riverside Falls was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to heal. 2 years later, temporary had become permanent. Catherine Sterling knew this story because she made it her business to know. Her private investigators had compiled a file thicker than most novels, documenting Owen's transformation from successful engineer to struggling craftsman. Bank statements showed a man living paycheck to paycheck, credit score hovering just above disaster. Medical bills from Sarah's final hospitalization still arrived monthly, each envelope a fresh reminder of loss. Yet somehow, Owen had never missed a single payment. He worked overtime at Miller's Hardware, built custom cabinets in his garage workshop, and still managed to attend every parent-teacher conference. The investigators called him financially vulnerable. Catherine called him fascinating. The next morning arrived with October's first frost-painting windows silver. Owen stood at his workbench, running his thumb along a piece of oak that would become someone else's kitchen cabinet. The wood grain told stories of seasons and storms. Each ring a year survived. His breath formed small clouds in the unheated garage as he measured twice and cut once, following the carpenter's creed that mistakes were expensive luxuries. The black credit card sat on the workbench like an accusation, catching morning light that filtered through cobwebs and old dreams. He'd tried to research the woman who gave it to him, but Catherine Sterling existed only in business journals and corporate press releases. Her face was always partially turned away from cameras, her personal life guarded by armies of lawyers and publicists. Miller's Hardware smelled of sawdust and possibility, its narrow aisles packed with solutions to problems not yet discovered. Owen navigated by memory, selecting screws and sandpaper with the careful attention of a man whose budget allowed no waste. At the checkout counter, teenage Melissa Thompson chewed gum and scrolled through her phone, barely acknowledging customers who couldn't afford to shop anywhere else. The register display showed $47.83. Owen's wallet contained $44.17. His pride contained significantly less. He reached for the black card, fingers trembling slightly as plastic met fluorescent light. Melissa's eyes widened as she recognized the Sterling Industries logo embossed in gold. "Sorry, I can't accept this," she said, her voice suddenly professional. "System doesn't recognize the account number." Owen's cheeks burned as other customers turned to watch his humiliation. He fumbled through his wallet again, hoping somehow the missing $3.66 would materialize from lint and desperation. A woman's voice cut through his embarrassment like warm honey poured over broken glass. "Let me help with that." Catherine Sterling stood behind him, but she wasn't the polished executive from magazine covers. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her jeans worn soft from actual use. She handed Melissa a crisp $20 bill and smiled at Owen with eyes the color of autumn leaves. "Katie Brennan," she said, extending her hand. "I just moved here from Seattle." Owen's handshake was firm despite his confusion, his carpenter's calluses rough against her surprisingly soft palm. "Owen Crawford, this is really kind of you, but I can pay you back." Katie waved away his offer with the casual gesture of someone for whom $20 meant nothing, but her eyes studied his face with an intensity that made his stomach flutter unexpectedly. "Consider it a welcome gift from one newcomer to another," she said. "Although technically, I suppose you've been here longer." Caleb chose that moment to burst through the hardware store's front door, his 8-year-old energy filling the space like sunshine after rain. He spotted Owen immediately and launched into a detailed account of his day, complete with hand gestures and sound effects. Katie watched the boy with an expression Owen couldn't quite identify, something between hunger and heartbreak. "This must be the famous Caleb," Katie said, kneeling to the boy's eye level with practiced ease. "Your dad talks about you constantly." Owen blinked in surprise since he'd never mentioned Caleb to this woman before, but Katie continued smoothly. "Mrs. Henderson told me all about the beautiful cabinet you're building for her kitchen. She says your father is the most talented craftsman in town." Caleb beamed with reflected pride, his chest puffing out like a small rooster. "Daddy makes the most beautiful things," he declared with absolute certainty. "He says good work lasts forever." Katie's smile flickered for just a moment, and Owen caught a glimpse of something raw and painful beneath her friendly exterior. "That's a wonderful philosophy," she said softly. The conversation stretched beyond polite small talk as they walked toward the parking lot together. Katie asked about Owen's work with genuine interest, her questions revealing a surprising knowledge of woodworking techniques. She mentioned needing someone to renovate the kitchen in her new house, a Victorian on Elm Street that had been empty for months. Owen knew the property, had walked past it countless times during his evening runs through the historic district. The asking price was 3 times his annual income, but Katie discussed purchasing it with the casual tone most people reserved for buying groceries. She offered him the job on the spot, promising payment generous enough to make his head spin. Something about her eagerness felt off, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong space. That evening, Owen sat on his front porch with a beer growing warm in his hand, watching Caleb practice skateboard tricks on the cracked driveway. The October air carried the smell of burning leaves and distant wood smoke, reminders that winter was approaching with its higher heating bills and increased grocery costs. The black credit card lay on the porch rail between them, catching starlight like a promise he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for being kind to a stranger today. Looking forward to working together. Katie." Owen stared at the message until the screen went dark, then looked up at stars he couldn't afford to wish upon. Something about Katie Brennan didn't add up, but his bank account wasn't in a position to ask too many questions. Katie's house turned out to be a masterpiece of Victorian architecture wrapped in decades of benign neglect. Owen walked through rooms that seemed to exhale history with each step, his trained eye cataloguing repairs and improvements that would take months to complete properly. The kitchen renovation Katie requested was just the beginning. This house needed love more than money, attention more than expensive materials. Katie followed him through the inspection tour, her footsteps echoing in empty rooms that should have been filled with furniture and life. She wore paint-stained clothes that looked authentically used but somehow too perfect, like a costume designed by someone who had studied poverty but never lived it. Her questions about the work were precise and informed, suggesting knowledge that came from more than casual interest. The previous owner was an antique dealer, Katie explained, as Owen examined the original hardwood floors. Mrs. Morrison lived here alone for 30 years before she passed away last spring. I bought it from her estate. She ran her fingers along the dusty mantelpiece with something approaching reverence. I've always loved old houses. They have stories to tell, don't you think? Owen nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. His own rental house was newer, but somehow less substantial, lacking the character that came from generations of lives lived within its walls. "This place has good bones," he said, testing a floorboard with his weight. "It just needs someone who cares enough to bring it back to life." The work began the following Monday with Owen arriving at dawn, his truck loaded with tools older than Caleb, but maintained with religious devotion. Katie greeted him with coffee and homemade muffins that tasted suspiciously professional, as if they'd been purchased from an expensive bakery and transferred to a home kitchen. She worked alongside him initially, claiming to want hands-on involvement in the restoration process. Her technique with basic tools was competent but careful, like someone who had learned from books rather than experience. Owen found himself explaining techniques and sharing stories about previous jobs, surprised by how easy conversation flowed between them. Katie listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in his craft. Caleb's presence transformed the house from construction site to something approaching home. The boy arrived each afternoon when school ended, his backpack heavy with homework and dreams. Katie's face lit up whenever he appeared, her smile reaching depths Owen had only glimpsed during quiet moments. She helped Caleb with math problems while Owen worked, her patience unlimited and her explanations clear. Sometimes Owen caught her staring at the boy with an expression of such longing it made his chest tight. She never mentioned children of her own, deflecting personal questions with the skill of someone who'd had plenty of practice. The three of them fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks, creating the illusion of family in rooms that desperately needed warming. The first sign that Katie Brennan might not be who she claimed came during their 3rd week of working together. Owen was installing new cabinet hardware when her phone rang with a tone that suggested urgent business. Katie stepped into another room to take the call, but old houses had thin walls and excellent acoustics. Owen couldn't help but overhear fragments of conversation that sounded nothing like the casual life she'd described. "The Beijing meeting needs to be rescheduled. Tell the board I'm reviewing the merger documents. The quarterly projections can wait until next week." Her voice carried an authority that came from years of command, nothing like the friendly uncertainty she displayed when asking about cabinet door styles. Owen continued working while processing this information, his hands steady even as his mind raced. Katie returned 15 minutes later with apologies about family business back in Seattle, but her explanation felt rehearsed. She resumed their previous conversation about wood stain colors with seamless professionalism, as if the call had never happened. Owen found himself studying her more carefully after that, noticing details that hadn't registered before. Her clothes were casual but expensive, her knowledge of construction techniques theoretical rather than practical. The calluses on her hands looked recent and superficial, nothing like the deep grooves that marked a life spent working with tools. The revelation came accidentally on a Thursday afternoon when Katie stepped out to meet with what she described as a local supplier. Caleb was at the kitchen table working on a science project about simple machines, his papers spread across the surface Owen had just finished sanding. The boy knocked over his water bottle, sending liquid cascading toward Katie's open laptop. Owen lunged to save the computer, his reflexes faster than his reasoning. The screen displayed what appeared to be financial documents covered in numbers that made no sense in the context of kitchen renovations. Sterling Industries dominated the header, along with quarterly reports and merger analyses that belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than Victorian kitchens. Owen stared at the screen for several heartbeats before his brain processed what he was seeing. Catherine Sterling. Not Katie Brennan from Seattle, but Catherine Sterling from Sterling Industries, one of the largest privately held companies on the West Coast. Her photograph smiled back at him from a business article dated just 2 weeks ago, her hair styled differently, but her eyes unmistakably the same autumn leaves he'd been learning to read. The article described her as reclusive but brilliant, a billionaire who inherited her father's empire and expanded it beyond anyone's expectations. It also mentioned her reputation for unconventional business practices and her tendency to disappear from public view for months at a time. Caleb's voice broke through Owen's shock as the boy asked for help with his science project, blissfully unaware that their world had just shifted on its axis. Owen closed the laptop carefully and spent the next hour helping his son build a pulley system from household items, his mind spinning with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Why would a billionaire pretend to need kitchen renovations? What kind of game was she playing? And what did she want from him? The black credit card suddenly made sense, part of some larger experiment he couldn't begin to understand. When Katie returned an hour later with supplies from a hardware store that definitely didn't carry the premium materials she'd purchased, Owen was ready with questions that had been building pressure like steam in a kettle. "We need to talk," Owen said once Caleb was safely distracted with his homework in another room. Katie's smile flickered but held, though something shifted behind her eyes like shadows moving through deep water. "Is there a problem with the work?" she asked, but her voice carried a tension that hadn't been there before. Owen pulled out his phone and showed her the business article he'd found, watching her face carefully as recognition dawned. "Catherine Sterling," he said quietly. "CEO of Sterling Industries. Net worth estimated at $3.7 billion. Katie's composure cracked like ice under pressure, her carefully maintained facade crumbling to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. The truth spilled out in fragments over the next hour, pieces of a puzzle that formed a picture Owen wished he'd never seen. Catherine had lost her son Daniel 3 years ago, leukemia taking him just 2 weeks after his 8th birthday. The same age as Caleb, the same bright smile and endless curiosity, the same way of looking at the world as if it were full of wonders waiting to be discovered. Catherine's marriage hadn't survived the loss, her husband unable to cope with grief that consumed everything in its path. She'd thrown herself into work afterward, expanding the company with ruthless efficiency, while her personal life withered like flowers in a drought. The credit card experiment had been her idea, a way to find someone different from the money-hungry sycophants who usually surrounded her. "I wasn't supposed to get involved," Catherine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was meant to be observation from a distance, clinical, scientific." She looked out the window toward the street, where Caleb rode his bicycle in careful circles, his concentration absolute as he practiced staying upright. "But then I saw you with him, the way you listen when he talks, the way you put his needs before everything else, even before your pride." Owen felt something cold settle in his stomach as the full scope of her deception became clear. "You've been watching us," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Not just the credit card thing. Before that." Catherine nodded miserably, unable to meet his eyes. "The surveillance had started months ago," Catherine explained, "part of a larger project to identify people who made decisions based on values rather than profit margins. Owen's background made him perfect for study. Recent tragedy, financial pressure, single parenthood. All the variables that should have made him easy to predict and simple to manipulate. But he'd defied every model her analysts had constructed, choosing integrity over opportunity at every turn. "I thought if I could understand how you did it," Catherine said, "maybe I could learn to be human again." The admission hung between them like a confession that couldn't be taken back, changing the fundamental nature of everything that had passed between them. Owen felt the betrayal like a physical blow, sharp and immediate and completely devastating. Every conversation, every shared moment, every time he'd begun to hope that maybe loneliness didn't have to be permanent, all of it contaminated by deception. "You used my son," he said, his voice deadly quiet in the way that meant real anger rather than mere irritation. "You used both of us for your emotional therapy project." Catherine flinched as if he'd struck her, tears beginning to track down her cheeks like rain on glass. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I never meant to care about you, either of you." The fight that followed was brutal in its honesty, stripping away pretense until nothing remained but raw truth that cut both ways. Owen accused Catherine of treating them like laboratory specimens, of buying her way into their lives with money and lies. Catherine fired back that he was being self-righteous, that everyone had a price and his happened to be financial security for his son. She pointed out that he'd taken her money for the renovations without asking too many questions, that he'd been willing to overlook inconsistencies as long as the checks cleared. Both accusations contained enough truth to draw blood, leaving wounds that would take time to heal properly. "Get out," Owen said finally, his voice rough with exhaustion and disappointment. "Take your money and your experiments and your guilt, and get out of our lives." Catherine stood slowly, moving like someone much older than her 42 years. She gathered her laptop and purse with careful precision, her movements deliberate, as if she were afraid of breaking something else beyond repair. At the door, she turned back one final time. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "loving you and Caleb wasn't part of the plan. That was real." Owen's response was silence, watching through the window as her rental car disappeared down Elm Street like a mirage dissolving in desert heat. The aftermath felt like winter settling into his bones, cold and lasting and impossible to escape. Owen threw himself into finishing the kitchen renovations with grim determination, working 16-hour days that left him too exhausted for painful thoughts. The house felt different now, haunted by conversations that had meant something entirely different than he'd understood at the time. Caleb asked about Katie constantly, his 8-year-old mind unable to process why someone who'd seemed to care about them would simply vanish. "Did we do something wrong, Daddy?" he asked one evening over dinner that tasted like cardboard and disappointment. Owen's heart broke a little more with each innocent question. The credit card remained untouched on his workbench, a black rectangle of possibilities he no longer wanted to explore. Owen researched Catherine Sterling obsessively during sleepless nights, learning about her business empire and her reputation for philanthropic projects that appeared generous but served larger strategic purposes. Sterling Industries funded children's hospitals and educational programs, always with perfect timing to generate positive press coverage. Every charitable act seemed calculated for maximum public relations benefit, just another form of investment with expected returns measured in goodwill rather than dollars. Owen wondered if their entire relationship had been practice for some larger deception. 2 weeks after Catherine's departure, Owen received an envelope with no return address containing a check for the full amount of the renovation work plus a substantial bonus. The accompanying letter was brief and formal, written on Sterling Industries' letterhead, as if their personal connection had been imaginary. Payment for services rendered, with gratitude for exceptional craftsmanship. No mention of shared dinners or quiet conversations, or the way Caleb's laughter had filled empty rooms with something approaching joy. Owen deposited the check because pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, but the money felt contaminated by its source. He used it to pay off medical bills from Sarah's final hospitalization, closing one chapter of financial burden while opening another of emotional confusion. The story might have ended there, with Owen and Catherine retreating to their separate worlds like wounded animals seeking solitude. But fate or fortune or simple human stubbornness intervened in the form of a phone call that came at 3 a.m, jarring Owen from uneasy sleep. The hospital's tone was professionally calm as they explained about the automobile accident, about Catherine Sterling's injuries, and about the fact that his name and number were the only emergency contacts in her phone. Owen's first instinct was to hang up and pretend the call had never happened. His second was to remember the way Catherine looked at Caleb, the hunger and heartbreak mixing in her eyes like storm clouds gathering over open water. St. Mary's Hospital smelled of disinfectant and industrial coffee, its fluorescent lights casting everything in the pale green tinge of institutional medicine. Catherine lay unconscious in room 314, her face marked by bruises that would fade, but somehow seemed to represent deeper damage. The nurse explained about her condition with practiced compassion: concussion, broken ribs, extensive bruising, but nothing life-threatening. She'd been driving alone on Highway 26 when her car went off the road, no other vehicles involved. The investigating officer suspected she'd fallen asleep at the wheel, though skid marks suggested she'd tried to correct course at the last moment. Owen sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair and studied Catherine's face in the harsh hospital lighting, searching for traces of the woman who had called herself Katie Brennan and baked muffins for his son. Without makeup and carefully styled hair, she looked younger and more vulnerable, like someone who carried too much weight on shoulders not designed for such burdens. Her breathing was steady, but shallow, each exhale seeming to push away dreams that might have been pleasant or terrible. A tablet on the bedside table showed dozens of missed calls and urgent messages from board members and executives who needed decisions only she could make. Even unconscious, Catherine Sterling was expected to be available for her empire's endless demands. She woke gradually, like someone swimming up from deep water toward distant light. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as consciousness returned in stages. Owen watched her remember where she was and why, saw the moment she recognized his presence and processed its implications. "You came," she whispered, her voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "I wasn't sure you would." Owen shifted in the uncomfortable chair, unsure himself why he'd driven 40 miles in the middle of the night to sit beside the bed of a woman who'd lied to him about everything important. "The nurse said you didn't have anyone else to call," Owen said, which was true, but not the whole truth. The complete truth was more complicated, involving the way grief created connections between people who understood loss in ways others couldn't. Catherine nodded carefully, wincing as the movement aggravated her injuries. "Richard would have come," she said, referring to her brother and business partner. "But he's in Hong Kong closing a deal that couldn't wait. The company doesn't stop for personal crises." Her tone carried bitter acceptance of priorities that put profit margins ahead of family obligations, a worldview Owen couldn't begin to understand. The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd shared during their weeks of deception and growing intimacy. Stripped of pretense by pain medication and emotional exhaustion, Catherine talked about her son Daniel with raw honesty that left both of them emotionally drained. He'd been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 2 weeks before his 8th birthday, the same cheerful child one day, and a patient facing mortality the next. The treatment had been aggressive and initially promising, filling their days with hospital visits and carefully managed hope. Catherine had put her business responsibilities aside to focus entirely on Daniel's care, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs and learning to read medical charts with the desperate expertise of a parent who couldn't accept powerlessness. "He was so brave," Catherine said, tears tracking down her bruised cheeks like rain on damaged glass. "Even at the end, when the pain was so bad he could barely speak, he kept trying to make us laugh. He said he didn't want us to be sad after he was gone." The memories poured out like water from a broken dam, years of suppressed grief finally finding expression in the antiseptic safety of a hospital room. Catherine described Daniel's funeral with devastating detail. The small white coffin, the children from his class who didn't understand why their friend wasn't coming back, the way silence had settled over their house like snow that never melted. Owen listened without interruption, recognizing the sacred nature of stories that had been locked away too long. "After the funeral, I couldn't stop working," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger as the narrative progressed. 18-hour days, 7 days a week, anything to avoid going home to his empty room. My husband tried to grieve together, but I couldn't bear sharing the pain. It felt like betraying Daniel somehow, as if moving forward meant leaving him behind. The marriage had crumbled under the weight of incompatible grief process. 2 people who loved the same child but couldn't find their way back to loving each other. The divorce was finalized on what would have been Daniel's 10th birthday, adding legal paperwork to the stack of endings that defined Catherine's new reality. Owen found himself sharing memories of Sarah's death in return, the unexpected reciprocity of pain creating intimacy more honest than anything they'd experienced during their weeks of careful deception. He described the phone call from the hospital, the endless wait in sterile corridors while surgeons fought battles they ultimately couldn't win, the way Caleb had asked when Mommy was coming home, his 5-year-old understanding unable to process the concept of permanent absence. The first night Owen had tucked his son into bed alone, promising everything would be okay while having no idea how to make that promise true. Grief had its own language, and they were both fluent in its brutal vocabulary. I envied you," Catherine admitted as afternoon sunlight slanted through hospital windows, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. "Watching you with Caleb, seeing how you'd managed to build something beautiful from something broken. I thought maybe if I could understand your secret, I could find my way back to being human instead of just functional." Owen considered this admission, trying to separate his anger at her deception from his growing understanding of her motivation. "There's no secret," he said finally. "You just keep getting up every morning and doing the next right thing. Eventually it starts to feel less impossible." The revelation about Catherine's true identity had been devastating, but her confession about Daniel reframed everything Owen thought he understood about her actions. The credit card experiment hadn't been clinical research, but desperate searching, a billionaire's attempt to understand how some people manage to survive loss without losing themselves entirely. Her deception hadn't been malicious but protective, armor against vulnerability that felt too dangerous to risk with someone who might reject her damaged authenticity. Owen still felt betrayed by her lies, but the betrayal was complicated now by recognition of the fear that had motivated them. "I need to tell you something else," Catherine said. As evening approached and nurses began their shift change routines. "The credit card experiment was real, but you weren't the only one being tested. I was testing myself too, trying to see if I could still connect with people outside the corporate structure that defined my entire adult life." She described the other 3 men with clinical precision: the lawyer who bought luxury items to impress clients, the doctor who chose expensive toys to distract from professional burnout, the businessman who purchased gifts for a wife he barely knew anymore. All of them had used the unlimited credit exactly as Catherine's psychological profiles had predicted. "But you didn't use the card at all," Catherine continued, her voice carrying a wonder that seemed to surprise her. 2 weeks of carrying unlimited spending power, and you never once considered using it for anything, not even necessities." Owen thought about those 2 weeks, remembering the weight of the black plastic in his wallet, and the constant awareness of possibilities he'd chosen not to explore. "It didn't feel right," he said simply. "Taking something I hadn't earned, especially from a stranger. I was raised to believe that shortcuts usually cost more than they're worth." Catherine's laugh was bitter and brief. "Everyone has a price," she said, quoting the philosophy that had governed her business dealings for years. "That was the entire premise of the experiment. Find the price point where integrity becomes negotiable." She paused, considering the implications of Owen's continued refusal to participate in her carefully designed test. "You proved me wrong about human nature. I'm not sure whether to be grateful or terrified by that revelation." Owen understood her confusion, remembering his own surprise at discovering that some of his fundamental assumptions about the world might be incomplete or incorrect. The hospital discharged Catherine the following afternoon with instructions for rest and follow-up care that she immediately began planning to ignore. Owen found himself offering to drive her home despite their complicated history, unable to abandon someone so clearly alone despite her vast wealth and supposed army of employees. Catherine's penthouse apartment occupied the top 2 floors of Portland's most expensive building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering views that money couldn't buy in smaller cities. The space was beautifully decorated and completely sterile, like a museum exhibit titled "How Billionaires Live," rather than someone's actual home. "Daniel's room is down the hall," Catherine said, noticing Owen's attention to family photographs that seemed strategically placed throughout the living area. "I haven't changed anything since he died. His clothes are still in the closet, his toys exactly where he left them." Owen recognized the preservation instinct, remembering his own inability to pack away Sarah's belongings for months after the funeral. Grief created shrines from everyday objects, transforming bedrooms into monuments that honored love while preventing healing. "Sometimes I go in there and read his favorite books out loud," Catherine continued, pretending he's still listening from somewhere. The admission was so raw and honest that Owen felt his anger dissolving despite his best efforts to maintain emotional distance. Catherine wasn't the calculating billionaire he'd imagined, but a broken mother who happened to have unlimited financial resources. Her wealth hadn't protected her from loss or provided shortcuts through the grieving process that everyone had to navigate alone. If anything, money had made her isolation more complete by surrounding her with people who related to her bank account rather than her humanity. Owen found himself staying for dinner, ordering pizza like normal people while sitting in a dining room that probably cost more than his annual income. "I have a proposition," Catherine said as they finished eating, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone making a business presentation. "Sterling Industries has a charitable foundation that builds community centers in underserved areas. I'd like to fund a project in Riverside Falls, something that would benefit families like yours." Owen's skepticism must have shown on his face because Catherine quickly continued. "This wouldn't be charity disguised as business. It would be a legitimate community investment with your input on design and construction oversight. You'd be paid consultant wages, not charity rates." The offer was tempting in ways that went beyond financial considerations. Owen had seen Riverside Falls struggling with limited resources for youth programs and after-school activities that working parents desperately needed. A proper community center could provide safe spaces for children while their parents worked late shifts or attended night classes. But accepting Catherine's offer would mean continuing their complicated relationship, risking further emotional entanglement with someone whose motivations he still didn't fully understand. "Why?" he asked. "Why this project? Why now? Why me?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring out at city lights that sparkled like distant stars. "Because Daniel wanted to help other kids," Catherine said finally, her voice soft with memory. "Even when he was sick, especially then, he talked about building places where children could play and learn and feel safe. He had this idea about a house where any kid could come if they needed somewhere to belong." She turned from the window to meet Owen's eyes directly. "I can write checks for existing charities, but I can't create something Daniel would have loved. That requires someone who understands what children actually need." The explanation rang true in ways that Catherine's earlier justifications hadn't, carrying the weight of genuine purpose rather than manufactured meaning. Owen agreed to consider the proposal, though he insisted on reviewing detailed plans and budgets before making any commitments. Catherine accepted his conditions without argument, arranging for architects and engineers to consult with him about community center designs that would serve Riverside Falls' specific needs. The project meetings were professional and focused, both of them carefully avoiding personal topics that might complicate their working relationship. But Owen couldn't help noticing how Catherine's face lit up when they discussed playground equipment and art rooms, spaces designed for the kind of childhood joy that Daniel would never experience, but might somehow honor through helping other children. Construction began 6 months later on a site donated by the city, with Owen serving as general contractor despite having no experience managing projects of such scope. Catherine remained in the background, providing funding and resources while allowing Owen complete creative control over design decisions. The building that emerged was beautiful in its simplicity, with natural materials and abundant windows that welcomed light and warmth. Local craftsmen contributed specialized skills, creating something that belonged to the community rather than imposed upon it by outside benefactors. The unofficial name became Daniel's House, though neither Owen nor Catherine discussed the designation that seemed to arise organically from workers and neighbors. The grand opening celebration took place on a Saturday in late spring, with families from throughout Riverside Falls gathering to explore the new facility. Children raced through art rooms and reading corners, while parents examined the industrial kitchen designed for community meals and cooking classes. Owen watched from the playground he'd designed with special attention to safety and accessibility, seeing Daniel's dream made manifest in the laughter and excitement of children who would benefit from resources they'd never had before. Catherine attended the ceremony quietly, staying in the background while Owen received credit for bringing the project to fruition. "He would have loved this," Catherine said, joining Owen on a bench overlooking the playground as afternoon sunlight painted everything in shades of gold and possibility. Her voice carried peace that Owen hadn't heard before, suggesting that building something positive from grief had provided healing that money alone couldn't purchase. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching children play with the unself-conscious joy that adults spent lifetimes trying to recapture. "Thank you," Catherine continued, "for helping me understand that moving forward doesn't mean leaving love behind." Owen nodded, understanding exactly what she meant, while recognizing that their own relationship would probably never progress beyond this moment of shared purpose and mutual respect. They had created something beautiful together, but the foundation had been built on deception and maintained through obligation rather than authentic choice. Catherine deserved to find healing that didn't depend on proximity to other people's family relationships, and Owen deserved connections that weren't complicated by guilt or gratitude. They were both good people who had tried to help each other in imperfect ways, learning important lessons about honesty and boundaries that would serve them better in future relationships. 6 months later, Owen received a postcard from Catherine postmarked from Switzerland, where she was attending a grief counseling retreat designed for parents who had lost children. The image showed mountains reflected in still water, peaceful and eternal and somehow hopeful. Her message was brief. "Learning to carry love instead of pain. Daniel's house remains the most important thing I've ever built. Thank you for showing me the difference between charity and love." Owen smiled and tucked the postcard into his toolbox next to other mementos from projects that had meant something beyond their immediate function. Caleb, now 9 years old and growing taller every day, asked occasionally about the nice lady who used to help with his homework in the big Victorian house. Owen explained that sometimes adults had to go different directions even when they cared about each other, a concept his son accepted with the resilience that children showed when the world made sense emotionally, if not logically. They visited Daniel's house regularly, with Caleb participating in art classes while Owen volunteered for maintenance and repair projects that kept the building functioning properly. The community center had become exactly what Catherine and Daniel had envisioned, a place where any child could find belonging and support when they needed it most. The black credit card remained unused in Owen's workbench drawer, a reminder of choices made and paths not taken. Sometimes he wondered what might have happened if he'd used Catherine's unlimited resources during those first experimental weeks, whether different decisions would have led to different outcomes for both of them. But regret felt pointless when the alternative had produced something as meaningful as Daniel's house, and the understanding that love could take many forms beyond romantic attachment. Owen had learned to build beautiful things from broken materials, and perhaps that was the most valuable skill anyone could master. The story of what Owen Crawford bought with Catherine Sterling's black credit card wasn't about purchases or transactions, but about choosing integrity over convenience, authenticity over artificial connection, and healing over harm. He had bought nothing with her money but built something priceless with her resources, a legacy that honored lost love while nurturing future possibilities. Sometimes the most expensive gifts were the ones that cost nothing and gave everything, transforming both giver and receiver in ways that no amount of money could predict or purchase. In the end, Owen's choice to leave the credit card untouched had been worth more than anything he could have bought, proving that some values remained priceless in a world where everything else seemed to have a negotiable price.